everybody. Welcome to another episode of Politically Depressed. As always, I'm your host, Eamon McAdam. As you can probably tell from the name of this episode, I'm going to be talking about some pretty dark stuff. It's a really important subject because it's definitely not talked about enough, and it's hard to talk about any one thing too much because things have been happening and accelerating, and now with the Iranian strike on Israel and potential Israeli response, even though that was a response to Israeli attack on an Iranian embassy, regardless, this thing has kind of been swept under the rug. And I think a lot of it is intentional. And so I'm going to be talking about Al-Shifa. I'm going to be talking about the massacre at Al-Shifa, which, by some accounts, once all the dust is settled, we may find it to be the worst, most horrendous, atrocious massacre that the Israelis have ever committed. The most bloody single massacre in the history of the Zionist colonization of Palestine. And so before I start this, I will just do one brief announcement, which is that I have a new subseries of this podcast called Keep This Between Us, wherein I tell stories and anecdotes that might not be the most relevant or the most sort of politically, urgent or anything. But I like telling stories. I don't necessarily want to put these stories on the main feed. So if you want to hear this and if you want to get to know me a bit better, you can hear these stories on our Patreon. You can become a member for as little as $5 a month. I'll provide the link to the Patreon in the descriptions below. And just for the lazy of you all, it is called patreon.com/firethesetimes. Anyway, so why do I really want to talk about this? Well, the day that the Israelis withdrew from the hospital is the same day that they assassinated these 6 or 7 international aid workers, which brought with it a whole flurry of condemnation, of international attention, especially from the circles that wouldn't pay much attention. But the Israelis killing 7 white people, kind of seemed to have crossed a line, but obviously did not cross it far enough. And obviously this assassination has many purposes, one of which is to prevent any aid in any form from reaching the people in Gaza, right? Even the fucking bare minimum. But another one, and I think is very revealing, was as a form of distraction. This is my opinion. And if something so egregious was the distraction, then the thing it must be distracting from must have been horrible. And indeed, ever since the Israelis besieged Al-Shifa hospital, or at least the second time they besieged them in March 18, don't forget, this is the same Al-Shifa hospital which the Israelis bombed, besieged, and attacked only a few months ago, in November. They came back again in the middle of March, during Ramadan, and the very first thing they did was that they kidnapped any journalists that were present. They killed one of the journalists' brother, Bayan, who posted about it before she herself was detained. And detention at the Israeli occupation forces is not a light matter. Many have reported torture, sexual assault, and so many of them are coming out amputated, with amputated limbs. It's seriously, I don't know how to describe some of this stuff. But so, as soon as the Israelis began to besiege the hospital, and this is a fucking hospital, I don't give a fuck about any of these claims, right? Like, we've been hearing for 10, 15 years about this underground network that Hamas... There's no evidence. They've been there. They did all their shit. They took over the hospital. They filmed every inch of it. They could not find anything. And the few tiny things they did find, aside from the obviously fabricated bullshit that they've placed in there, does not in any way justify the complete destruction of this medical facility. It's very clear, and it's one of the reasons that this present moment makes us all feel so incredibly insane, because it's just so fucking obvious what they're doing and what they want to do. And so seeing the entire institutions of the world, the biggest media organizations and all these people kind of giving any credence to what the Israelis are saying and like still asking the questions of, well, was there Hamas there and whatever? Anyway, I'm going to pull back a little bit because ever since the Israelis began the most recent siege of Al-Shifa medical complex, we've been hearing horrible stories, accounts by survivors of systematic rape. One story in specific that has kept me up at night ever since I heard it, of a woman who was raped and whose family, especially her husband, was forced at gunpoint not to close his eyes as they did this to her. There are numerous accounts of people being executed point blank. Now that the Israelis have left and people have returned to the complex and found it completely in ruins, just completely destroyed, all of it, it's one of the most criminal things to see this hospital, before and after. This has absolutely nothing to do with Hamas. This has nothing to do with the captives. I don't think any of us believe any of this anymore. I mean, I never believed it, but I can't imagine the person that's not completely delusional that thinks that there's even a part of it that's still true. Anyway, they're finding mass graves. They found a body in one of the mass graves that had a catheter. The person had a catheter still inside of them, right? There are people that they're finding who are still handcuffed. There are accounts of just doctors and patients being summarily executed. All of this in a medical facility that the Israelis have already taken over. There's just this concept that the cruelty is the point. There are some people... I'm sorry. I know I'm really getting into this, but I have no idea how the fuck any of us are meant to pretend like this didn't happen. And that this is just continuing. I don't know. I don't know what the fuck to do. I went to this kind of rally, and it wasn't a rally, it was kind of a protest today here in Vienna to mark Palestinian Prisoner Day. And there were like 15 people dressed down as prisoners and blindfolded. And it was organized by Not in Our Name, which is, I guess, like a group of anti-Zionist Jews. And I don't know, the music they were playing, the sound, there was a person reading, it was like pre-recorded. It just felt so incredibly flat to me. I don't know. I couldn't really say anything. I just said this is kind of weird. Because again, when I say that the music was weird, I get that it was kind of meant to be replicating the sounds of explosions or like the kind of ambiance of war. But it sounded like some weird dubstep. Just it was really weird. And I, as someone who has heard a lot of explosions over the course of my life, that's not what they sound like. It's frustrating. And the only way I can describe it is like somewhere between triggering and cringe. I have no idea how to describe that. But anyway, I kind of kept my mouth shut because it's just so easy being a critic, right? And especially because I don't have an alternative. Like, don't do this, do something else. And so I don't want to be, a negative Nancy. But I don't know how this addresses the present moment in any sense of the word. I don't know how any of this matters. Everything feels so fucking useless, Like, in terms of us here discussing and sharing ideas and thoughts and what we can do and what we can contribute to, everything feels so fucking useless. And it really feels like they are not just the Israelis, but the European backers, the Germans that have completely lost their minds, completely like going neck and neck with the Israelis, with how much they've been brutalizing the protesters and how much they've been cracking down. There was a thing that was happening called the Palestine Congress last weekend, and the German police just the first day, the first 2 hours, came in and shut it all down. They first shut off the electricity, they shut off the vents, then they shut off the live stream, and then they said this whole thing is banned. They arrested protesters, most notably Jewish protesters with like a fucking like watermelon yarmulke on his head. And then what the US have been doing, and the global order is really shifting. I had a conversation a few days ago wherein I was repeating something I've heard a lot about: the collapse of Zionism, the collapse of this project, and it's bringing us all down with it. And the person I was talking to, a friend of mine, said, yeah, it seems like it is in a state of collapse, but it's like the whole world is shifting with it. You know, not as though the state of Israel will no longer exist, but rather the world order that, you know, we were kind of used to over the last 20, 30 years or something has just completely fucking shifted. And so it's becoming much more like the Zionist fucking entity. So how does Al-Shifa Hospital and the massacre that was conducted over 2 weeks there are reports that possibly 1,500 people were killed, murdered, martyred in Al-Shifa Hospital over the course of this 2-week campaign. I mean, so like some of the first images we were seeing when people were going there were of skeletons, were of bodies kind of sticking out of the... Jesus, I have no idea. Like, the only thing I can do is to keep talking about it. The only thing I can do to avoid being like completely insane, but also in a way that feels like I'm addressing it in some way. I don't think I fully finished any critique I had of this protest I went to. I don't think I have a fully fleshed out critique. It's just this feeling of being there and thinking, okay, definitely just does not in any way match how I feel inside. I find myself like this in a lot of protest spaces. And I'm not saying I'm 100%, I'm the guide, but that feeling of rage, that feeling of wanting to resist the feelings of impotency, or even the feelings of grief, I didn't find that at all there. And I mean, I think the obvious critique is that it's performative, but it's literally a performance, so like that's a pretty moot argument. I don't know. One thing I've definitely said a lot on this podcast is trying to imagine ourselves in other situations that we've probably played out in our minds before, What would we have done then? And I think none of us are living up to that moment now. Or very few of us. Because it's fucking scary. Actually thinking about what needs to be done. Not just to think that I can do. I think there's one thing that really irked me, which is after this protest and after they sort of dressed up and people were talking, they were all gonna go party. And I'm not a person who thinks that joy has no place here, but we're not talking about our own struggles. Like, these are protests in solidarity with Palestine. I don't know, I just feel like there's so much more work that needs to be done at the local level, at the international level, whatever. And that none of us are really living up to the present moment, or at least not a substantial number. I don't think I am. And I think about that all the time. But anyway, I'm kind of going on several tangents here. But so, I really want to think a lot about what happened at Al-Shifa. Because again, if I'm right, and the Israelis executed and assassinated these 7 international aid workers to distract from this, then they know what they did, right? I mean, they know what they did, but as in, they know the severity of it. And obviously they know more than anyone what they did because they arrested all the journalists who were there, and people are only now fully understanding and uncovering the bodies. But so, that's something that happened. And nothing has stopped since. It's only gotten worse in Gaza, but also now at a more regional level with Iran, with God knows what's going to happen now with Hezbollah. My prediction is that the Israelis are not going to attack Iran directly, but will attack Hezbollah, or will attack like Iranian assets. I kind of shat myself today because I'd read that there are reports that the Iranians have started like pulling out their like people from Lebanon and Syria. And so, as always, there's a kind of like Iran-Israel bullshit, and Lebanon's going to pay the price. And there's a really boring discourse about how all of this fully distracts from what's happening in Gaza. And sorry, I shouldn't have said it's boring, because a lot of it is true. And if something escalates, there's going to be a lot more tension there. But there's a kind of logic that things were heading in the right direction vis-a-vis Gaza. That like there was all this momentum building up and this pressure and this attention. And that this attack on Israel kind of will detract from that attention. But what did that attention really add up to? You know, what good was that attention? It wasn't like there was a ceasefire right and ready, you know? Like the UN Security Council voted on a ceasefire. There is a motion that passed for a ceasefire. But the Israelis can just reject it, can just deny it, can just be like, whatever, fuck it. Because all that matters is the US. They abstain, but yeah. And so what are we waiting for? Like, if the ICJ comes out and says, like, this is a genocide, cool. Like, is that actually going to materially change? I mean, it will in the long term and whatever, and I don't know. I think one thing I think about a lot when I think about how I'm processing this moment, how I'm trying to grieve, and to also, in that kind of ironic way, pre-grieve what I'm really worried the Israelis will do to Lebanon, and the precedents that they have set, and they continue to set, and that the world sets by allowing them to do the things they do with no repercussions. You know, the Israelis bombed an Iranian consulate. That is in violation of like some of the most basic international treaties that date back like 200 years, right? You do not attack another nation's embassies. Killing, I think 16 people, two of whom were like commanders in the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, who are pieces of shit, don't get me wrong. I'm no simp for the Iranian state, but there was no repercussions of that. The only thing that you heard in the media was, oh no. Oh, well, actually, no. A lot of people just didn't report it. And so then they only report then when the Iranians attacked, and so now it's like the European Union are talking about more sanctions against Iran, and Israel is like this piece of shit, snot-nosed bully, piece of fucking... I can't. And so I find myself really thinking a lot of the times, in reflecting on the actual things that are happening, you know? This 2-week-long massacre that happened at Al-Shifa Hospital, and thinking about what that means for the world, what that means for everybody, that this is something that did happen, that is going to continue to happen, and that no one is really able to stop it. And so, who are we in this present moment? What are we kind of waiting for? What are we expecting to happen? And I don't know. Are some of these things we do just us filling quotas? Just like, oh, we did the thing we should have done today? Like, I often reflect, is me doing this podcast kind of me doing a quota, you know? That like, oh, okay, I did something, I talked about whatever. And again, I've said this enough times, like, for me, the quota isn't necessarily just always has to be about Palestine, even though I think that is the most pressing issue right now, especially in the West, and in the Arab world, but like as in the governments that are most supporting the genocide, and the populations that are like tacitly supporting. But like everything, there's so much collapse happening and going to continue happening, and that we know is going to happen, that needs to be prevented. Otherwise, if we wait too long, if we wait for the collapse to come, it's too late. I mean, fuck. Like, I don't know if people are seeing this footage that's coming out of like Dubai and Oman, the floods. Like, Dubai is just the most fragile city, the Emirates as a whole, and so much of the Gulf. And one heavy rainfall, the whole city collapses. The whole city just like halts, right? And those types of extreme weather are just going to repeat more and more. And so even at the very local level, I just don't see people... Fuck me. I have no idea. Sometimes I worry I expect too much from people. But I constantly remind myself that this isn't something that I want people to do. It's like a reality that I see most people avoiding. And I'm someone who's talked about death my entire life. And even as a teenager, I'll talk about death, and most people will tell me to stop, and I'd be like, no, because it's fucked up that you're not talking about it. Like, it kind of really reminds me of my current struggle, and I'm not sure if I drew this analogy earlier, but it's that thing that the reason that death is such a difficult thing for me is because it is such a taboo to talk about. No one wants to talk about death, about their death and other people's death, and that creates a kind of climate wherein you can only think about death by yourself. It drives you mad. And so I constantly want to push against that and be like, no, let's talk about death because I don't want to feel crazy, and it's not my fault that death happens, you know? And it's this horrible, shitty inevitability. And that the reason most people don't talk about it is because they're scared and they don't want to admit it. I mean, I'm scared too, but like, fuck, I don't want to be scared alone. I don't know. I don't know if I'm making any sense. Again, I'm wrapping this up. Not sure if I really made a single important, interesting, or like revealing point. But that's where I'm at. Still within the grief, still trying to process, still trying to find new ways of engaging. And yeah, coming up short. Anyway, this is another episode of Politically Depressed. If you enjoyed this episode, I have a tip jar in the description for as little as like $3. Think of me as like an online street performer. And yeah, as always, consider leaving this podcast a review or a 5-star rating, which really helps with the algorithm. And I guess that's about it. I hope you all stay well, and I'll see you all next week.